Alright, so now we're going to continue with our investigation into the Norman dynasty in England, which was the first of the next few dynasties that will go on to rule England as well as other areas within the British Isles and other areas within Europe in general, all throughout the medieval time period, on down to the Renaissance era, and even after that as far as the 17th to the 18th centuries. All of the ruling dynasties and families would in some way, shape, or form have the blood of the Normans running through their veins. So the Normans basically were the forefathers of the vast majority of the medieval population within the areas of Europe they spread out to, especially amongst the noble upper class of society. And so this is why it is important to diligently go over this dynasty so that we can set the stage for the other medieval dynasties that will come after the Normans, so that it can be understood that the royal families that ruled in England as well as other areas within the British Isles such as Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, as well as other areas like France and Spain, were so-called black, just like their Norman predecessors. I've already shown this particular image a number of times, which depicts the Normans either during the time of the forefather of the Normans Rollo in 1919, invading the land of Guernarde in Brittany, or the Normans sailing across the English Channel en route to conquer England in 1066, led by the great William Duke of Normandy, otherwise known as William the Conqueror. I already showed that this was the most accurate depiction right here that exists of William, this statue at the York Minster Cathedral in England, seeing as it depicts him having the tightly curled afro-like hairstyle. And despite this statue being an accurate portrayal of what William looked like, or at least the closest thing to an accurate portrayal of what William looked like, it has still been altered due to it being painted over and quote-unquote restored to a degree during the Victorian Restoration, where the architects of this era were quite literally tearing down statues all throughout England and replacing them with statues that fit their ideal of what a certain historical figure may have looked like in history. And we can see an example of this when we take a look at the other more quote-unquote restored images of William the Conqueror that are at places like Lichfield and even other statues and busts. These have been clearly altered to fit a certain narrative about what William the Conqueror looked like. But referring back to the manuscript image of the Normans that portrays them as a people of color, we should know that William himself had to have been a man of color, seeing as though these were the people he was related to and descended from. So again, this is the most accurate image of William that exists, but now we can move forward and take a look at some of the successors of William the Conqueror, who will go on to rule England after his death in 1087. And the first of his successors that will go on to take on the mantle of king after William the Conqueror was his son, who was also named William and was known as William Rufus during his life. And we'll get into why that is and why he was given that nickname in a little bit here. But just to give a brief background of who William II or William Rufus was, like I said, he was the successor to William the Conqueror after William the Conqueror's death, mainly due to him being William's favorite son. The problem, however, with him inheriting the crown of England was that he was not the firstborn of William the Conqueror, and his eldest son, William I's eldest son, Robert Curthose, was given the Duchy of Normandy instead of the crown. And so this sparked a rebellion against William II in 1088, which was even further fermented by nobles living in Normandy and England at the time, who thought that they could not possibly act in the interest and please both William and Robert at the same time. So they came to the conclusion that both Normandy and England needed to be brought under the rule of one person again, and decided that Robert would be the one to rule over both provinces. The rebels that led the rebellion against William II or William Rufus was William the Conqueror's half-brother, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, and it also included Norman-born nobles such as Robert de Marlbray, Geoffrey de Montbray, Roger of Montgomery, Roger Bigod, and a few others. But the supporters of William II, who advocated for his rule to still remain intact, were people like Alan Rufus, William de Warenne, and Hugh of Arances. And I just wanted to highlight some of those names because the contemporary physical descriptions that were given of them and some of their family members will help to reinforce the understanding that the nobility of Europe during this time period were a people of color. But again, we'll get into that later. But long story short, the rebellion ended with William II coming out on top after he captured his uncle, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, after a series of sieges that were laid over a 6-week time period against the Penvesey Castle in Sussex, as well as the forced surrender by the rebels in favor of Robert Curthose due to the soldiers he was sending from Normandy being driven back because of bad weather conditions overseas. And so in the aftermath of this rebellion, one of the two leaders, Bishop Odo, was stripped of all his possessions in England and was sent back to Normandy on a permanent exile. And then William II's brother, Robert Curthose, was allowed to stay within England and was able to maintain his estates in Normandy, as well as as long as he recognized his younger brother William Rufus as the King of England. And so from this series of events on, William's reign wasn't a very good one. He was constantly fighting in rebellion after rebellion due to his less than favorable style of rulership during his tenure as king, and he was looked at as a corrupt tyrant during his lifetime. And this all culminated itself on August the 2nd, 1100, when he was shot in the throat by an arrow that was presumably fired by one of his men while on a hunting trip. And this was no doubt a response to the horrible reign William II presided over while he was king and the dictatorship he precipitated. But regardless of how his reign went, he was one of the kings who ruled in the Norman dynasty. So that means we're going to look at some of the contemporary descriptions that were given of him while he was alive. So let's see a few of those real quick. So as has been stated a multitude of times thus far, William II of England was known as William Rufus during his lifetime, and the reasoning for him being given this nickname, most believe, was either due to his hair color or his skin color, or even both. But most agree that the name Rufus was given to him due to his skin color being reminiscent of this Latin word Rufus. Now, the understanding of what this word means today is something or someone who is quote unquote red of mainly hair and then sometimes even complexion. When you look up the modern definition of Rufus, that's essentially what you're going to see, along with other words that derive from Rufus, such as the more modern version of this word we know of today as ruddy, also means red, either of the hair or of complexion. Now, the implication behind this term from someone being quote unquote red or Rufus or ruddy today means they have, like I said earlier, red hair, but the other definition used for skin color usually comes out to mean that someone has a pale complexion with a red undertone to their skin. Something that could sort of look like this right here, or even like this, will be a modern example of what this term Rufus or ruddy would mean to us today. But just like with other terms I've gone over on this channel, terms like swarthy and tawny, and even the word black to describe someone's complexion, what we know these words to mean in our modern day interpretation is not how they were used back during the medieval time period, and even going all the way back to the ancient world. Words such as Rufus or ruddy did not mean someone who had a pale complexion with a reddish undertone on their face, which of course would lead one to believe that this term ruddy is talking about a Caucasian person. But rather, Rufus and ruddy were actually terms that were meant to indicate that someone was of a more brown complexion than anything else. The original definition of what the word ruddy meant, as opposed to what it means today, is still held when talking about things like animals who have that word attached to them, which is why when you look up animals such as the ruddy or Rufus duck, it appears brown, and then Rufus birds like the Rufus hummingbird, ruddy or Rufus cows, and even the Rufus purple-winged butterfly, they all appear to be brown in complexion. There was even a term that was created in and around the late 18th century known as Rufous, spelled Rufous, and that was said to have derived from the archaic Latin term Rufus, and it means something that is of a reddish-brown color. Now, what most linguists will try to do is lie and state that ruddy means something different for animals than it does for humans, since for animals it means reddish brown or just brown, and for humans it supposedly means someone with a pale skin color with reddish undertones in their cheeks and all around their faces. And if we were to believe that narrative, then William II Rufus would have definitely looked like how the mainstream historical narrative portrays him, which is as this right here, a pale-faced Caucasian man with a reddish undertone in his face. But like I stated earlier, this kind of complexion is not what the term Rufus would have entailed back during the medieval time period or even the ancient world. One example of a historical figure who, like William II Rufus, has had this term Rufus falsely attributed to him to mean a pale-faced Caucasian man or even a red-haired Caucasian man is none other than one of the most famous biblical characters of all time, King David. King David was described in a very similar fashion as William Rufus in the scriptures, but again, like William Rufus, his description has been translated completely wrong and has been taken completely out of context. But let's see what I'm referring to real quick here. Now, when it comes to King David, his physical characteristics have been the cause for much controversy over the last couple of centuries, even though most modern-day translators try to act like it was a discussion back during the medieval time period to the early days of the church, but it really has been only a topic of debate for modern-day biblical and even secular scholars. But that's another story for another day. But as of right now, we'll just discuss David and how he was described from the perspective of him having the same exact word that was given to William II of England to describe his skin color, which of course was the term Rufus. There are a couple of scriptures in the Bible where King David is referred to as Rufus already, but we'll just take a look at perhaps the most well-known one in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 12. Now, the specific translation that attributes the word Rufus to David comes from the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible that was written as early as the 4th century AD. So let's read this original Latin translation right here. So, Mesit ergo et aduix iam arat atum Rufus et Pt.Ii. And for those of you who are wondering what all of that said, the translation is, and he was sent for and was brought in. Now he, David, was ruddy, or Rufus, and was beautiful or good looking. Now, obviously, we see here that King David was referred to as Rufus or ruddy. And now that we've seen this right here, let's get a better understanding of what was meant to be implied by King David being called Rufus, and what the etymology of this term was, even going into the ancient Hebrew language. So now let's read an excerpt from this book written by a professor at Johns Hopkins University to see how this term Rufus was defined in the context of how it was used in the Latin Vulgate, as well as how other translations understood terms such as Rufus, red, and ruddy to mean when it was applied to a figure like King David. So let's read this real quick here. So the Vulgate translates the description of David in 1 Samuel 16 and 12, Erat atum Rufus et Pt.Ii aspectu decore fese. But the Hebrew word rendered Rufus means brownish. Okay, so Rufus, according to this professor, was a word that was rendered or translated from the original Hebrew word to denote a brownish color. And the reasoning for this was because the term Rufus itself was a term that meant something or someone that was of a brown color. Okay, but let's read one more excerpt to put this into better context. So now from this excerpt, we are going to get the specific Hebrew word that was translated and rendered Rufus by the Latin Vulgate. So let's read this. So Michelis admitted in his notes that admoni, the Hebrew word that was translated to Rufus, might denote a yellowish brown color. Luther rendered brownish. The Orthodox Lutheran theologian C.F. Keel has the correct translation. So the translation this author is about to cite is from the exact same verse I referenced that described King David in 1 Samuel 16 and 12. And according to this author, this translation is the quote-unquote correct one of 1 Samuel 16 and 12. So let's read what this translation says. So he, or David, was brownish and with all of beautiful eyes and goodly to look upon. And then it goes on to say that this person tried to render the term that meant brownish to mean red-haired, which just goes to show you how much a lot of these modern-day scholars have tried to alter the meaning of words to suit what they want a certain word or phrase to mean as they deemed fit. Because we clearly see here that he translated beyond a shadow of a doubt David as being brown or brownish in complexion, but he tried to overturn that and state that it means red-haired. But we'll get even further confirmation that this is not what was implied. But anyway, we see here that the translation for the term Rufus in 1 Samuel 16 and 12 was brownish, which is confirmed by this author, who states that this explanation is based on the translation given in the Latin Bible, Erat atum Rufus et Pt.Ii aspectu decore fese. So we know that this had to have been what was implied by the term Rufus. And again, the reason as to why this term Rufus was the specific word that was translated means brownish was because it, like its Hebrew predecessor admoni, was a word that also meant to indicate a ruddy or reddish brown color. Now, let's read down further to see what the author of this book has to say about this term admoni. We'll start where it says the majority of the modern day commentators to see yet another example of how these modern translators have tried to change words from the ancient time period to mean something totally different. But anyway, let's read. So the majority of the modern commentators explain the Hebrew term admoni, which the authorized version renders ruddy as red-haired. So you see, the modern day translators have tried to change the word admoni into a hair thing. that means somebody who just had red hair to try and make it seem like David was a man who had red hair. And just to refer back to the main subject where I'm comparing to David in this little section of the video, William Rufus, you'll oftentimes see scholars try to make this same assertion about William Rufus and say that he was described as Rufus due to his hair color being red. But this is not the case, as we'll see, as we'll continue to see over and over again throughout this video. But reading on, it says Dr. John Skinner, principal of Westminster College, Cambridge, says in his excellent commentary on Genesis, it is usually explained of the reddish brown hue of the skin, but there is much to be said for the view that it means red-haired. So you see again, even though these so-called Caucasian scholars routinely acknowledge that these terms like Admoni and Rufus were words that primarily and in a lot of cases really exclusively were meant to imply skin color and not hair color, they need to push their own narrative about history so much that they have to constantly inject this alleged possibility of these words that were used for complexion to mean hair or some other physical trait other than the skin color. And as we go along with this medieval series, we'll see that more and more, but we'll see that phenomenon more and more. But anyway, we see here that this professor from Westminster, Cambridge, says that the term Admoni, which was the term that was translated to Rufus in the Latin Vulgate, was a word that meant someone who had a reddish brown complexion, okay? Not a pale red or pale complexion person with red undertones to their skin, but someone with a reddish brown complexion. And so this would mean that this was the complexion David had, which would in turn, since they were described by the same word, mean that William II Rufus would have also been of this same complexion. But before we can come to this conclusion, let's do a little bit more looking into of this word, of the word Admoni, to even further confirm that the term Rufus was a word akin to someone having reddish brown skin complexion or having a reddish brownish skin color rather than a pale red complexion like the modern definition would suggest. So let's look at a couple examples of what the term Admoni and even the term Rufus meant during the ancient world, just to reinforce the understanding that terms like Rufus, ruddy, and Admoni all meant when describing someone's physical appearance, specifically their skin color, a brown or a reddish brown color, not a pale color with red undertones, which is why all of these words are synchronous with one another and why Rufus can be translated to mean the same as Admoni, which again means being of a reddish brown complexion. But let's start out by reading this first excerpt from a Jewish encyclopedia to first get the definition of the word Admoni. So the adjective Admoni describes a reddish brown complexion. Okay, so straight up like that, Admoni is in fact a word that was in reference to someone being of a reddish brown complexion. And again, this was the word that was translated in the Latin Vulgate as Rufus. So if Rufus was the word that the translators of the Vulgate used to substitute Admoni with the Latin term that was used to indicate something being of a ruddy complexion, and reddish brown was what was meant to be implied, then Rufus, just like Admoni, had to have meant reddish brown as well. But Admoni was not the only Hebrew term that meant being of a reddish brown being of a ruddy complexion. There was another word that was meant to indicate this hue of ruddy, and it is a word that actually can be better identified as a name that in fact was the name of the first man made by the Most High in Adam. Adam's name in the Hebrew language also has ties to the word ruddy and its definition. So let's just see how the name Adam was defined and how it was linked to ruddy. Okay, so let's read this biblical commentary made during the mid-19th century by a biblical professor from Oxford University in England to see what this name Adam meant and how it relates to ruddy and by osmosis Rufus and Admoni. So Adam, this term means red or ruddy, and this color corresponds with our brown. Why the first man should have such a name, we are not told. It may be because he had a brown or brownish complexion. So right here it states that Adam's name, which meant red, really ruddy, was a word that corresponds with our modern day word for brown. And then it goes on to explain that Adam was given that name to indicate the color ruddy because he had a brown complexion. So ruddy back then was regarded as being of a more brown color than anything else, and the red aspect of it comes from the reddish undertone to the brownish color of whoever it was being referred to, or who was being referred to when that term was applied to them. So ruddy was a term that was again originally not how we use it today, but originally when it was applied to somebody or something, it meant a reddish brown or really brown with reddish undertone. okay, which is far different from the modern day definition of ruddy, which is a term that means somebody who has a pale complexion with a reddish undertone to it. But let's just take a look at one more source to confirm this. So this is a biblical dictionary written by one of the more revered scholars of the 19th century on history, William Smith. So let's see how he defines the word Adam and how it was used to mean ruddy. So 4 Hebrew terms are rendered man in the AV. Adam, the name of the man created in the image of God. It appears to be derived from the Adam, he or it was ruddy like Edom. Now, I'm not going to go deep into that last part regarding Edom and the supposed relationship the Edomites have with the same term that was used to describe biblical figures like Adam and David right now, because that will be another thing for later. But just from this little excerpt right here, we can see that the name Adam was a term that was associated with being ruddy, right? So now let's look down a little bit further and see what ruddy or red implied in the Hebrew language. So the name Adam has been supposed by some to be derived from Admah, earth or ground, because Adam was formed from the dust of the ground, but the earth or ground derived this appellation from its brownness, which the Hebrews would call redness. Okay, so again, we see yet another example of the term ruddy being a word that actually meant brown, but the last part of this sentence is interesting because it keys us in on the fact that the ancients would use words that today to us mean one thing, but back then they meant something totally different. But I'll dive more into that later on in this video. But now we can definitely come to the conclusion that words such as Rufus and ruddy did in fact mean a more brownish color than anything else in the ancient world. This is even further exemplified by the antecedent of these two words, admoni, which is equivalent to our red or ruddy today. An example of what something that is admoni or red in color, according to the Hebrew word admoni, is the red or ruddy heifer, which is translated as the admoni heifer in the original Hebrew text. Now, you can clearly see that this quote-unquote red heifer or cow is not actually red, or at least not primarily red, but it is rather an animal that is more so brown with a reddish undertone to its fur. So this would be an example of what the complexion of a person who had an admoni or ruddy or Rufus complexion would look like. Their skin color would look somewhat like this. And just to refer back to David and how he was described as Rufus, which we should know by now meant reddish brown, we can see examples in medieval art of what this kind of complexion would look like according to the people in medieval Europe through some of their artistic depictions of what he looked like. Here is one right here from the Hall of Giants at Trinity Palace in Italy, and this portrait right here was made in 1411, and it clearly shows King David with a brownish complexion with a reddish undertone to it, and we can clearly see that he is depicted as a man of color or a so-called black man unmistakably right here, which are the main demographic that would brandish a complexion such as this. Here is another Italian artistic rendition of David made in and around the early 1400s. And again, we can clearly see that David is depicted with a brown skin complexion again, with also a reddish kind of undertone to his skin. And he is once more portrayed as a man of color or a so-called black man here. This is a depiction of David made by the Byzantines from the Bristol Psalter in the early 11th century AD. And again, you can clearly see that David is portrayed as having a brown skin complexion with that reddish undertone to his skin. And you can clearly see that he is portrayed with kinky hair, again, showing him to have been so-called black. Here is one more image from that same manuscript made by the Byzantines in the early 11th century. And again, he has the brown skin with reddish undertone as well as the kinky hair. And then here is just one last portrayal of David from a Russian icon made in and around the 1500s, which is a little bit after the medieval time period, but not that much after. But either way, King David is once again portrayed having a brown complexion. So we should get the point by now. King David, being a man who was described as being Rufus in complexion, which of course was the epithet given to the son and successor of William the Conqueror, William II Rufus, was described that way because he was a man of reddish brown complexion, not pale complexion with a red undertone or red haired, but somebody who was red brown in complexion or skin color. So there is no reason to doubt that this is what Rufus meant back during this time period. So with this being the case, it would also mean that William Rufus had to have been of the same complexion. And just for extra proof that words like ruddy or Rufus, when translated in the scriptures to describe figures like King David, was meant to indicate brown, we can take a look at a few other, a few earlier English translations that were made even before the first quote unquote universally recognized English translation of the Bible, which was the King James 11 version, was made. We can still see that ruddy or Rufus was rendered brown. This is seen in one of the first English translation Protestant Bibles, the Tyndale Bible, which for those of you who don't know, the Tyndale Bible was actually known for being heavily influenced and tied to the Latin Vulgate, which is of course the version that translated the word that was used for David's skin color to being Rufus, or that was the version of the Bible, the Latin Vulgate. That was the version that translated David's skin complexion as Rufus. So the translation for this particular English version of the Bible should be able to accurately denote what that term meant when it was used to describe David. So let's take a look at how the Tyndale Bible translates the word Rufus in the English language. So let's read this translation of 1 Samuel chapter 16 and 12 that comes from the Tyndale Bible, which once again was heavily influenced by the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible. Okay, but let's read this. So, and he sent and brought him in, and he, David, was brown with goodly eyes and well favored in sight. All right, so again, we see that the word Rufus was rendered in the English language to mean brown, which should tell us that this was in fact what that term Rufus meant. And even in other early English translations like the Great Bible, which was commissioned to be made by King Henry VIII and was also very heavily influenced by the Latin Vulgate, the term brown is used in place of Rufus. So this is all the confirmation that we need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Rufus was a term that meant someone who was of a brown or reddish brown complexion. The same kind of complexion that was displayed in the examples I showed of King David and how he was portrayed in medieval art as being clearly a man of color with a reddish brown or just brown skin complexion. So just to bring this back to the main subject of this point of the video, William Rufus, with the understanding we have now of what that term Rufus meant back then and how it was applied to people back then, we should be able to come to the conclusion that William Rufus was also of this particular complexion, making him a man of color just like King David. His complexion would have looked something like this, like the complexion of these two boys right here. See how they have the brown skin, but it also has a red tint to it or a reddish undertone to it. This is what a person who was Rufus would have looked like during that time period. All right. And this is what William Rufus himself would have looked like as well. So even though we know William Rufus was a man of color, there is still a bit of a problem because William Rufus also had the color of his hair spoken about. And this may raise questions with some people as to how William Rufus could have been a man of color, but also have his hair be described by historians such as William of Malmesbury as having quote unquote fair or light hair. The word that was used to describe William Rufus's hair color was the Latin term sufflavo. Sufflavo is basically a variant of the word flavus, which in Latin means yellow. But the thing is, in the Latin language, just like a lot of the other ancient languages, words, especially color terms, do not mean just one thing, and oftentimes would be put on a spectrum of different variations of that very color. It's different from today, where we interpret a certain color term to mean a very specific color, and this interpretation oftentimes is translated when modern day translators try to translate ancient Latin or even Greek terms. We already saw an example of this with the term Rufus, which when you look up modern day definitions of the word, it almost uniformly is basically described as a red or reddish color. But as I was able to show, Rufus could and oftentimes was rendered as a more reddish brown color or even just a straight up brown color. Even the Hebrew word Adam or Adam, which is defined as red today, when you look it up on biblical translation websites like Blue Letter or Bible.org, those websites will only tell you that Adam means red or a red color. But again, according to the ancient Hebrews and their language, they rendered the name Adam to mean ruddy or red, and it coincided with what we would associate today with brown. Okay, even according to the renowned 19th century scholar William Smith, what we would think today as the color brown was called by the Hebrews a certain reddish, i.e. reddish brown color. Okay, another example, which is probably more apt for this comparison, we're making of different Latin color terms and how there were multiple colors that would encompass one word, was the word that was used to describe the father of Constantine the Great, Constantius the First, or Constantius Chlorus. Um, this is probably the best example. This is probably a good example for how scholars try to attribute certain meanings to historical figures to push a certain narrative about that figure. But most scholars just try to attribute this term Chlorus to Constantius the First to mean that he was a pale-faced man or a pale-skinned man. But in reality, Constantius Chlorus was not at all a pale-skinned man, but he was actually described by a contemporary of his who actually knew him by the name of Eumenius as being a man of very sanguine skin color. And sanguine is yet another word that means someone who is brown-skinned with a reddish undertone. So he was not a pale-faced man. Constantius the First was not a pale-faced or pale man, but a man of color. And that term Chlorus was not meant to exemplify his paleness, but it most likely was because of the garments that he wore, the color of the garments that he wore, which were said to have been of a green color. And when you look up the term Chlorus in any dictionary, it can also mean anywhere from a light to regular green color to a yellowish color. So the ancients once again had multiple different meanings for one word, especially color terms. One more example of this actually comes from the Greek language, and this particular word is actually very closely related to the term flavus in the Latin language. One could even say that this is the Greek equivalent of the word flavus in that particular language. This word xanthus or xanthos, however you want to pronounce it. But xanthos was a term that, just like flavus, could mean yellow, but it also had other meanings as well. So xanthos could mean yellow, yes, but it could also mean various other different colors too. And this is according to the modern and past scholars who have interpreted this word to mean a multitude of different colors. The modern-day highly renowned Greek classicist and professor Tim Whitmarsh said in an essay he wrote that, as Maria Michelle Sassy's essay for Aeon makes clear, the Greek color vocabulary doesn't map directly onto that of our modern English. Xanthos, the word that is usually rendered brown, could be used for things that we call brown, ruddy, yellow, or golden. And then he says in a later paragraph that xanthos could translate from brown to fair, but either way, we see here that this renowned Greek classicist even admits that the way in which colors were perceived and even defined by the ancient languages is not the same as how we would perceive them today. He even used the example of Achilles, who was described as having xanthos hair in Homer's Iliad. The term xanthos is often described as blonde or yellow, and although that is a definition of xanthos, that is not the only definition of that word. Achilles could have been either yellow-haired, or he could have even had brown hair. But what a lot of modern-day scholarship does with historical and even mythological figures that are associated with a certain civilization, like Achilles in ancient Greece, is take a word and then just apply the most so-called fair-skinned or fair-haired implicating word to that figure. Just like with Constantius Chlorus and the reference that I made earlier a little bit ago, where he has just been identified as pale by most modern day scholars, but again he was referred to as sanguine or reddish brown in complexion while he was alive by a contemporary who knew him, so he was in no ways a pale man. And so just going back to the word xanthos and the multitude of different meanings that word had, there are other scholars who made the same assertion that Tim Whitmarsh made in his essay. I know a lot of people are very skeptical of the author of one of the more controversial historical books of the 20th century, written by a man by the name of Martin Bernal, which was entitled The Black Athena, but he too was a highly renowned and educated professor, and he even states that xanthos did not just mean yellow or blonde or golden, but it could also mean brown as well. So he stated this, and also the early 20th century anthropologist Giuseppe Sergi stated xanthos meant not only fair, but also chestnut, which is a shade of brown that can go from reddish brown to even dark brown and just regular brown. And then one last example I'll use comes from a book called Natural Philosophy. It's a book that was originally published by a professor at Harvard University, but I couldn't find his name. But anyway, he states that xanthos was a word that encompassed various colors from, again, brown, auburn, which is very similar to chestnut and can encompass colors from reddish brown to dark brown, and also flaxen and red hair are included as well. So the point is that xanthos, just like other color terms from the ancient world and how they were applied to people, could mean a multitude of different colors, not just what most modern scholars will have you believe it exclusively means, which is yellow. And so that brings us back to this term that was used to describe William Rufus's hair, which was sufflavo. Now, as I said, sufflavo was a word that derived from the Latin term flavus, which, like xanthos, often is translated as yellow. But also, like xanthos, it was not just a word that meant yellow or light colored hair, but it could also mean of a brown or brownish color as well. The words that have oftentimes been equated to flavus, besides the color yellow, have been colors such as chestnut and auburn, which are two colors that are today defined as being more reddish brown, but their etymologies actually indicate a more dark brown color. But let's just see a few people who correlated the term flavus with chestnut and auburn before we get the understanding of what these terms meant, in order for us to see what the actual hair color of William II Rufus was. And something to keep in mind is the understanding we should already have of him being a man of color, just as the term Rufus implied him to have been, along with the example I used of King David and how he was portrayed by the people of the medieval time period in their art. It would have been very likely for him to have had light. It would not have been very likely of William Rufus, to have had light-colored hair, as the given definition of sufflavo implies him to have had. But let's just look at some examples of the term flavus being correlated with terms that meant brown, such as chestnut and auburn. So the first example is going to come from a scholarly examination of natural history that was compiled and written in, I believe, Bavaria, Germany. And in this description of what the word flavus meant, it is giving an example from the perspective of what other meanings the word could bear in the context of animals and their fur. But just as the previous example that was given of Rufus or ruddy, and how it applied the same to animals who had rufous or ruddy colored skin or hair as it did to humans, so it is with this term flavus. So let's read what this person has to say about what the other words that could be equated to flavus were. So, but recollecting, and then that Greek word, though commonly used in natural history as synonymous with the Latin flavus in English yellow, it is also capable of bearing the meaning auburn or even chestnut. Okay, so we see here that the term flavus was a word that could in fact mean auburn or chestnut and not just yellow, which again is often the only color that we get told can be attributed to flavus. But just like in the case of the Greek equivalent of flavus, xanthos, this is not the case at all. And I believe in a couple of the examples I gave that showed flavus being something that could mean multiple different colors other than just yellow, terms like chestnut and auburn were also used to describe what xanthos meant. So like I stated earlier, in the ancient world and in antiquity, and even in the medieval time period, words that were used to describe color in particular did not just have one linear meaning like how our color terms do today. Please understand that. So a word like yellow to us today in our modern day sense can mean what we define as the color, like the color of a banana or something, or any other shade of yellow that exists on that color spectrum for that particular shade. But to the peoples in antiquity, one word could encompass a multitude of things, and attributing our modern understanding on how we look at and define color terms to how the ancients did is not the correct thing to do. One very prominent ethnologist by the name of Dr. John Badeau, who existed during the Victorian era and was actually known for and viewed to this day as a pioneer in making observations about the hair color and eye colors of people living during the ancient times and antiquity, as well as the people of his day as well. He was specifically focused on the study of what the appearance of people from the ancient world was, and more specifically, what the terms that were used to describe peoples from the ancient world and antiquity meant. So let's read his account on what terms like flavus meant and what he equates this term to mean. So let's read what this ethnologist, Dr. John Badeau, had to say about the color term flavus, but also his admission that even scholars of his day would mistakenly define a color to mean something totally different in our modern time period than what was meant to be implied during antiquity. But let's read this. So finally, the descriptive statements of ancient geographers and historians, even when obviously intended to be careful and accurate, are liable to two qualifications, one of which is our ignorance of the precise shade of meaning their contemporaries and countrymen attach to certain adjectives of color. So basically, he is saying here that the modern historians and geographers of his day were ignorant to what the different shades and colors of to what the different shades and colors peoples from the ancient world and antiquity would use to encompass the meaning of multiple different colors whenever they were applied to something or someone. And this problem persists even down to today, which is why we see terms like flavus only being defined as one color, when in reality it could mean a multitude of different colors. But let's just skip down a little bit here where it says, thus almost all French. So thus almost all French anthropologists say that the majority of persons in the north of France are blonde, whereas all Englishmen would say they were dark. Each set of observers setting up as a standard what they are accustomed to see around them at home. What is darkish brown to most Englishmen will be chestnut in the nomenclature of most Parisians, and perhaps even blonde in Auvergne or Provence. An ancient Roman might have called it sufflavis or even flavus. Okay, so we see here that according to this highly renowned ethnologist, John Bedeau, sufflavis, which was the exact word that was used to describe William II's hair color, and flavus, the word that sufflavis comes from, were words that could be equated to terms like chestnut or darkish brown or a darkish brown color. So again, the term sufflavis or flavus could and did encompass the word chestnut and or darkish brown. So when that term was applied to someone like a William Rufus, who again was given that term to who was given that name or that nomenclature due to his skin color, which we should know by now was a reddish brown color or a shade of brown with red undertone to it, it cannot so easily just be identified. This term sufflavis cannot just be easily identified with the word yellow or a light color like yellow. Like I said earlier, with him being a man of color, with William II Rufus being a man of color, as we should know him to have been, it is more likely that his hair fell on the quote-unquote chestnut or dark brown hue of what that term meant. Chestnut is usually defined as a kind of reddish brown or dark reddish brown color. And an example of what that color would look like on hair would be this right here. This would be an example of a so-called black man with chestnut colored hair. And as you can see, it is very dark in color, but not quite black. You can see that it is dark brownish red in color. And another example of how dark the color chestnut can be comes in the form of a description of a portrait depicting the Queen of Scotland and mother of King James VI slash the first Mary Queen of Scots, and how it was described. Her portrait was described as having a rich chestnut tint that almost looked black in color. So again, chestnut was a very dark color and certainly differs from the yellowish light colored shade we're led to believe words like flavus or sufflavis exclusively meant. So we got the understanding of the word chestnut and how it applies to sufflavis or flavus, but the other word I would like to examine is the word auburn, which was oftentimes specifically equated to sufflavis. According to this 19th century English scholar by the name of Joseph Edmund Riddle, in his Latin to English dictionary, the term sufflavis could mean yellowish or auburn. And then also according to the renowned 19th century English lexicographer William Smith, the term sufflavis was a word that meant inclining to auburn. And then one last example of the term sufflavis or sufflavo being rendered auburn is the translation of a book written by one of the closest friends to the Lord High Chancellor of England during the reign of King Henry VIII, Sir Thomas More. And this book was written by a man by the name of Erasmus. And in the book, he gives a physical description of Thomas More from his hair color to his skin color. And the book was originally written in the Latin language, which of course is where we get terms like flavus or sufflavis from. And in the book, he describes Thomas More's hair as being sufflavo nigror, which translated by this book's translator Francis Morgan Nichols read in the English language as his hair is auburn or sufflavo, inclining to black, or if you like it better, black inclining to auburn, which again is sufflavo. So we can see here that auburn had to be denoting a dark color that was close to black instead of a light one, because a light color such as yellow would not be able to be so closely related to black as to quote unquote incline towards being that color. And when we look up definitions of auburn from dictionaries made in and around the time the translation of this book was made, we can see why auburn is so closely related to black according to the translator of this book. When we look at the closest dictionaries that was written at the time of this author's translation of Erasmus, which is in the Noah Webster Dictionary dated during the mid 1800s, we can see that auburn is defined as brown or of a dark color. And then from a dictionary made a little bit before the translation of this book was made or was given in the late 1700s, this dictionary was made in the late 1700s by Samuel Johnson. The term auburn is defined as brown and of a tan color. And then lastly, from a dictionary written during the mid 1700s by the renowned English lexicographer Nathan Bailey, auburn meant a dark brown color or even a chestnut color. So this is even further confirmation that both the terms we've seen that have been rendered for flavus and even suflavus, which are auburn and chestnut, did in fact mean a dark brownish type of color. And so that brings us back to William II Rufus, who we should know by now was actually a man of color or a so-called black man, and not a pale-faced man with reddish undertones to his skin and yellow hair, just based off of the information that I've presented thus far. And just beyond that, William II Rufus had his ancestry traced back to the Dub Ginty, or black complexion Danes, who I've already showed a true to life depiction of and what they looked like. These men were once again the black or these men were once again called the black or the swarthy men, and were referred to also as the negri gentis, in which that word negri was equivalent to one of the Latin words that was used to denote so-called blacks in the Latin language, which was mori, which denoted people who we would know today as the quote-unquote Moors. So they were given these epithets, the Danes were, because they were a people of color. And William II Rufus, again, being a descendant of theirs, should confirm even further that he was also a man of color as well. There is not a completely accurate depiction of him that is available to display, but William II Rufus would have looked something like this, or something along the lines of this. This is not a manuscript depiction of William Rufus, but rather it's a manuscript depiction of Charles the Great, otherwise known as Charlemagne, who will be somebody that I talk about in much later videos, along with the bevy of the other emperors that ruled in what is known as the Holy Roman Empire. But we can see here that Charlemagne is depicted with the brownish skin, which is what Rufus meant back during antiquity and even the medieval time period. And he also has the brown hair as well, which again was another term for the was another meaning for the term flavus or suflavo, which was the word that was used to describe William Rufus's hair. So this is something along the lines of what William II Rufus would have looked like during his lifetime. And interestingly enough, Charlemagne has been described historically in a similar fashion to William Rufus. I believe one of the more earlier descriptions of Charlemagne, known as the Chronicles of Turpin, stated that Charlemagne was of a ruddy, i.e. reddish brown complexion, and that he had brown hair, which is the exact same description that was given to William II. So again, this is something along the lines of what William would have looked like. But another medieval figure that was prominent at a later date from when William Rufus lived and ruled in England during the Third Crusade time period, who, as a matter of fact, descended from Charlemagne and was also an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, was a man by the name of Friedrich Barbarossa. Friedrich Barbarossa, like William II, was also falsely attributed a pale reddish complexion and yellow hair and alleged descriptions that were given of him. But when you look up some of the more authentic medieval depictions of him, you can clearly see that he was depicted as a man of color with, again, dark brown or chestnut / auburn colored hair. So this is proof that the modern translators and historians go through great lengths to try and obfuscate the meanings of words, especially in languages like Latin and Greek, since those are the languages that inspired a lot of our modern day dialects. And so they obfuscate the meaning of words like flavus or Rufus, or even Greek words like xanthos, to push a certain narrative about history and about what certain historical figures look like. But this is why you have to go back and really research and understand the etymology of the languages and the words these translators are allegedly trying to accurately translate. But now we should be able to clearly see that the son of the establisher of the Norman dynasty in England, William the Conqueror, who was known during his lifetime as William Rufus, was in fact a man of color and was actually described as such when the words that were used to describe him by William of Malmesbury are put in their proper context. And so since we have an understanding of the physical appearance of William Rufus, I just want to go over the physical appearance of some of the more minor figures during his time period on the throne of England that played a role in the rebellion against him, led by his own older brother Robert Curthose I mentioned earlier. I'll probably be doing something like this moving forward, throughout the entirety of my medieval series, where I'll go about mentioning minor nobility figures that existed during the same time period as the main subject of my videos. But anyway, the first person I want to take a look at that played a major role in actually the defense against Robert Curthose and his desire to take his brother William Rufus off the throne was a man by the name of Alan Rufus, who was obviously just as William II, given the name Rufus, and he was given this nickname or this name because of his complexion, just like William II. But Alan Rufus was of Breton descent, which was someone from Brittany, and the peoples of Brittany spoke three languages, which were Latin, and then also a Celtic Brittonic language that was created by the original Celts that resided in Europe, which the Britons descended from, and then also the French language. So amongst the people of Brittany, Alan Rufus wasn't called Rufus, he was called Alan Leroux. That term Leroux was basically just the French form of the word Rufus or ruddy, and had pretty much the same meaning as Rufus and ruddy, which was reddish brown, and was applied to someone because of their complexion. But let's just look real quick and prove this to be true. So now let's take a look at the etymology of the term roux, to see what word this term that was applied to William Rufus or Alan Leroux derives from and what the term's origin is. So let's read this real quick here. So in cookery or sauce made from browned butter or fat and flour used to thicken soups and gravies, 1813 from French beurre, roux brown butter from roux red, reddish brown from Latin russus, which is related to rubber, red from pie roux, red, ruddy. Okay, so this definition gives kind of the modern way the term roux is used, which is for a butter that is used in food. But even with that example, it states that the butter is of a brown or browned color. Here's an example right here of what the type of brown this definition alludes to would look like. So it's already alluding to the fact that the term roux was a word that was meant to denote something that was brown in color. And then it goes on to state that in its past form, during the medieval time period, roux was a term that meant red or reddish brown, which is the color that this term originally meant. Just like the word Rufus originally was meant to denote a reddish brownish color as well, as I showed earlier. And then it states that roux was a term that derived from the Latin word russus, which we would pronounce today as rusette, and that derivation from the Latin term rusette is important to understand and remember, because it will help to identify even further that roux was a word that primarily meant a brown color. But let's look into this term roux a little bit more. Okay, so now let's read this French and English dictionary written by the 19th century lexicographer John Bellows to see how this term roux was defined. So the first definition of roux that is mentioned here is roux, reddish brown, brown sauce, browning, thickening. Okay, so again, it gives the understanding that roux was a word that was pertaining to a reddish brown or brown color. Okay, and then the second instance where this definition for roux is given in this dictionary is right over here, and it says roux, rus, reddish brown with reddish or auburn hair. And then again, that term russet is mentioned, which was the Latin term this word roux derives from. Okay, but again, roux is defined to mean reddish brown a second time. But what a lot of modern day historians and scholars try to do is whenever a color epithet was given to someone of renown in history, either a nobleman or a warrior or a politician or a king, emperor, etc., modern day scholars will try to attribute those epithets to them, meaning the person's hair color or even eye color or something else besides the skin color or complexion of that person, to try and obfuscate the fact that the vast majority of the people who had those color terms or those color epithets applied to them were peoples of color. This goes all the way back to the time period of the Romans and even before the Romans, but the Romans are the most modern example of a civilization that would apply color epithets to a certain person of note or renown during their lifetime, due to their complexion. The Scottish antiquarian by the name of Robert Sebald, in his historical antiquities on the Romans and in Great Britain, states that as Nigir and Rufus, right? Rufus being one of the names that was given to guys like William Rufus, and the subject that we're speaking of right now, Alan Rufus or Leroux, right? But reading on, he says, were names of families amongst the Romans from the color and complexion of men. Okay, so the Romans applied these color terms to the color or complexion of an individual, not to their hair or their eye color. or any other physical characteristic. But just like how you have historians today who will try to come out and state that William II had that term Rufus applied to him because of his hair color, even though the Latin translation, which says colore rufo, is meant to imply skin color. You have people who will still try to state that William Rufus had red hair, but he didn't. He had a Rufus or quote unquote reddish brown complexion or skin color. And so going back to Alan Leroux, again, yes, he was called Leroux or Rufus because of his skin complexion, not his hair. So I just wanted to make that clear before we move on. But let's take a look at another example of this term roux and how it derived from the Latin term russet, which again can help us confirm that this term roux was a word that was meant a brown color and was meant to denote that Alan Rufus was of this particular brown or reddish brown complexion. This is an etymological dictionary of the French language written by a 19th century French author by the name of Auguste Branchet. So let's look and see what word he derives the term roux from. So we see the term roux, and next to it is the word red and the word russet, which comes from the Latin rusus. So this word roux is a term that is equal in meaning to that of the word russet, and this word russet is a term that means brown or reddish brown and even dark brown in color. But let's just see a few examples of its definition real quick. So let's see this first definition of russet to get its etymological meaning. So mid-13th century, coarse woolen cloth, usually of a subdued reddish brown color. Also early 15th century, the color of this from Old French russet, from rosette, reddish, diminutive of rose, rousse, red from Latin rusus, which is referred to rubber, red from pyrobrut, rioda, red ruddy. Okay, so we see here that this term russet was a word that meant reddish or reddish brown in color, just like we see the term roux meant from the dictionary definitions I cited from. So let's look at another dictionary that defines this word russet, and this is going to come from the very well-known Samuel Johnson's dictionary made during the late 1700s. And he defines russet as being a color that is reddishly brown. Okay, he states next to that word is derived Rufus. So that is even more confirmation that not only does this term russet mean reddish brown, but that the aforementioned Rufus also meant a reddish brown color as well when it was originally used to describe, of course, Alan Rufus and also William Rufus. But now let's take a look at one of the many dictionaries made by the well-known Noah Webster to see how this word russet is defined. So rosette, diminutive of roux, red. So again, russet and roux pretty much have the same meaning and are intertwined with one another, which is why they both come out to mean a brown or reddish brown color. But anyway, Latin rusus, akin to English red, of a reddish brown color. Okay, or according to some red gray, also of yellowish brown color. Okay, so again, we see that this term russet is not only akin to roux, but is also a term that meant reddish brown. And then Noah Webster goes on to say that it could mean also red, gray, or yellowish brown. But the main definitions we've seen define it as brown or reddish brown in color. So we see that russet is a term that again is heavily tied to the term roux, which is what Alan Rufus was called during his lifetime by his compatriots, and is the name he is known as to this day, and that it also means reddish brown in color, or in the case of Alan Rufus, specifically a reddish brown complexion. But this is not the only definition that russet has. Russet has also been rendered to be a more dark brownish color as well. This is according to Wikipedia, but if you're like a lot of people and don't really trust Wikipedia, there are a couple of dictionary definitions of this word russet that render it as a dark brown color. The first one being from an English lexicographer by the name of Nathan Bailey, who was actually quite renowned during his time period as a lexicographer and was said to be the main source of information behind Samuel Johnson's dictionary made during the mid to late 1700s. But anyway, Nathan Bailey states that again, russet is derived from the Latin term Rufus. Again, same epithet given to Alan Rufus and even William Rufus or William II of England. Right, and he states that russet was a term that was meant to be defined as a dark brown color. And then when we go to a dictionary made even further back than this Nathan Bailey dictionary, from a dictionary source created by a man by the name of John Kersey, a late 17th century lexicographer, he also states that russet was a term that meant a dark brown color. So we should get the point by now. But just to recap, Alan Rufus was referred to in the English and the French language which was one of the main languages that was spoken of in his native land of Brittany as Alan Leroux, and that epithet of Leroux meant a reddish brown color and was equal to the word russet, which was a term that, as we've seen, meant anywhere from a reddish brown color to a dark brown color. And by the way, this is what a russet color would look like. Obviously, this is a very rich medium to dark brown color. So Alan Rufus, being called Leroux during his lifetime, was an epithet given to him because of his complexion, much like how King William II of England was given the nickname Rufus because of his complexion. And both of these terms, which are also synchronous with one another as well, were applied to these men and others during their time period because they were of a brown, reddish brown, or even dark brown complexion. And just extra proof of Alan Rufus being of this certain brown complexion comes from an epithet that was actually given to two closely related family members of his, one being his literal brother, who went on to succeed Alan Rufus as the second lord of the feudal barony of Richmond in North Yorkshire, England, which was actually first gifted to Alan Rufus by William the Conqueror after he helped William in the conquest of England. But this brother of Alan Rufus, also named Alan, was given the epithet to differentiate from Alan Rufus of Nigir, or Alan Nigir. And then another family member of theirs, both Alan Rufus and Alan Nigirs, was their nephew, who went on to become the first Earl of Richmond and also assisted the last Norman King of England, Stephen of Blois, during the over 18-year-long conflict in England between King Stephen and the last surviving child of William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry I, who was known as Empress Matilda. He was also called Nigir. He was also given the nickname of Alan Nigir. But the point is that both of these men, named Alan Nigir, were given these names because of, once again, their complexion. The word Nigir was meant to imply a so-called black or swarthy complexion. And I've already gone over this term Nigir on this channel before when I spoke about the Danish Vikings and how they were called Nigris. And that term was just a plural form of the Latin Nigir, which according to Latin dictionary sources that were written by the very highly renowned 18th century lexicographers Robert Ainsworth and Nicholas Salmon, meant being of a black or swarthy complexion. Again, referring back to the Scottish antiquarian I cited from earlier by the name of Robert Sebald, terms like Nigir and even Rufus were words that were meant to imply someone's skin color or skin complexion, not their hair or any other physical traits. These men were called these terms because they were having their physical appearances being described, and the main aspect of their physical appearances that were meant to be exemplified by these terms like Nigir and Rufus or even Brun, which meant just straight up brown, was their skin color. And a brief example of this, and this will kind of act as a preview of what's to come in my next series on the Plantagenets. But a perfect example of a medieval figure who was given a certain epithet that denoted the color of their complexion was a man by the name of Fulk, who was the third Count of Anjou. Fulk was one of the ancestors of the incumbent dynasty that was established after the Norman reign in England. After that ended in 1154, which I already referenced, were the Plantagenets. But during Fulk's life, he was given a nickname, much like how Alan Rufus and both Alan Nigirs were given nicknames that meant red or reddish brown and black respectively. He was given the nickname Nera, which was an old French form of the term noir, and both these words meant black, and so Fulk went on to become known as Fulk Nera or Fulk le Noir, which translates to Fulk the Black in the English language. Fulk le Noir was called this particular name because of his complexion, and this is backed by the English 19th century English novelist Charlotte Mary Yonge, who stated in her cameos from English history book that Fulkis was named Nera, an old form of le Noir or the Black. Okay, the name was derived from his complexion. Okay, so Fulk le Noir was called this term, which again translates to the black in English because of his skin complexion. And this was even well known amongst the French in their history as well, which is why in the history of the kings of France, written by the early 17th French friar Aslam de Sainte-Marie, he states, Fulkis the third Comte d'Anjou, surnommé Nera à l'honneur à cause de son tient, which translates to Fulk the third Count of Anjou was surnamed Nera or Lenore because of his complexion. All right, so again, folk was called this because of his actual skin color or skin complexion. And what even further connects this name that was given to folk of Anjou and the subject of this portion of the video, which are Alan Rufus and his two relatives, who were both named now Alan Nigir, is that both of them were also referred to as Lenore, just like folk. So again, that term Lenore was applied to someone because of their complexion, not their hair color or their eye color or anything else. So both Alan Nigirs were referred to as those terms because they were both, as the word Nigir suggests, so-called black men or black complexion men. And so was Alan Rufus or Leroux, who was called as such to differentiate from his brother, who was given the name Nigir or Lenore to differentiate from him because his brother was what we would call today a quote unquote dark skinned so-called black man, and Alan Rufus most likely tended towards being what we would call today a quote unquote brown skinned or maybe even a light skinned so-called black man. So that's Alan Rufus, who was on the side of William II during the rebellion that was being waged against him by his older brother Robert Curthose. But on the other side, amongst the ones who were on the side of Robert Curthose and against William Rufus, one of the leaders of this rebellion was a man by the name of Robert de Maubrey, who was from the highly esteemed Norman family from the county in France known as Montbray, which is where their family name Maubrey came from. Mowbray was the Earl of Northumbria from 1068 to 1095, where he had to forfeit his estates after he and the other rebels, along with Robert Curthose, had lost to William II and his forces, which included Alan Rufus, and was sentenced to be imprisoned for the rest of his life in Windsor Castle. But he was later released and became a monk at St. Albans Abbey. So Robert de Mowbray was a pretty significant figure during one of the more significant times in William II's reign. And since he was such a significant figure during this time period in history, a good portion of his life was documented by chroniclers at the time. One of the major chroniclers at the time, who was one of the major documentarians of the Norman time period in England in general, was known as Oderic of Vitalis, and he described Robert de Mowbray in great detail during his lifetime. So let's read his description according to Oderic of Vitalis. All right, so let's read this contemporary description of Robert de Mowbray. So Robert, son of Roger de Mowbray, was distinguished for his great valor and wealth. His high spirit and military daring caused him to hold his fellow nobles in contempt, and inflated with empty pride, he disdained obedience to his superiors. In person, he was of a great stature, bulk and strength, with a swarthy complexion and shaggy beard. Now we see here that the obvious operative term here is swarthy to describe his skin color or complexion, and this term swarthy is something I've gone over numerous times on this channel, but it still seems to be a bit controversial on my channel pertaining to what it meant during this time period around the 12th century, and even just in general during the medieval time period. People still seem to think that this term was only supposed to denote a person who was just a little bit more tanned than your average pale-skinned Caucasian person. And even though that may be a disputable modern-day definition for this term swarthy, that is not what it meant. Again, what it meant during the medieval time period. Okay, so let's just take a look at an example of what swarthy meant during this time period by taking a look at how a more minor figure in history, who was also of Norman descent, how he was described and how it compared to another group of people in history who were depicted as so-called blacks in medieval manuscripts. So in order for us to see what this term swarthy meant during the medieval time period, let's see how it was applied to a Norman poet who was a somewhat prevalent figure during the reign of King Henry III of England, who was the son of King John and the father of Edward I Longshanks, by the name of Henry Arances. So let's see how he was described by a contemporary. So Henry of Arances described Blancpain, the Cornish writer, who you have the legs of a goat, the thighs of a sparrow, and the sides of a boar. You have a hare's mouth and a dog's nose, the teeth and cheeks of a mule. Your face is a calf's, your head is a bull's, and from head to toe, you are as swarthy as a Moor. Now, a couple of things that are interesting is, number one, the fact that a Norman, we should already know by now, the Normans were mainly comprised of peoples of color, which of course is the whole purpose of this series, is showing that. But for those who still have doubts, how could a Norman who was supposed to have been a pale-faced Caucasian person have been so dark as to have been compared to a Moor? who were customarily depicted as so-called blacks all throughout the medieval time period. And not only that, but the fact that this term swarthy was a word that was equated with being the skin color of the Moors by this medieval writer in his description of Henry of Arances should tell us all that we need to know about what this term meant during the medieval time period. As I stated earlier, the Moors, or at least the Moors that originally came from North Africa, and not just any Muslim person at the time who identified as a so-called Moor, were always depicted in medieval manuscripts as peoples of color or so-called black people, which is what they were, going all the way back to the ancient times. According to ancient historians like Herodotus, the peoples of North Africa, or as the ancient Greeks called it, Libya, were more quote-unquote woolly haired than any other group of people on the planet Earth at the time. Of course, woolly hair being a term that denoted so-called Afro-textured hair, and then just the name that was given to the Moors during the ancient world, such as the Greek term moros or the Latin term morus, which both meant black and was meant to denote the complexion of the people that lived in North Africa, or Mauritania as it was known. And then the word during the Middle Ages, the word Moor during the Middle Ages was also stated to be a synonym for a Negro, even after the Middle Ages time period was over. During the Renaissance time period, the word Moor was used by people like William Shakespeare as a synonym for a Negro as well, which is why characters like Aaron the Moor, who, by the way, was described as swarthy in complexion by Shakespeare himself, and was unmistakably a so-called black man, as he was portrayed in the play Titus Andronicus, and then also Othello the Moor, who was another so-called black character. Okay, so again, the fact that the term swarthy was what was used to describe the skin color of the Moors, and by osmosis, the skin color of Henry of Arances, a Norman poet, should once again tell anybody who doubts what this term swarthy meant during the medieval time period. Okay, and going back to Robert de Montbray, who was described by Oderic of Vitalis, who spoke the Old or Middle English dialects, if I'm not mistaken. Oderic of Vitalis did, and then he also wrote in Latin. And what we'll find when we look at the Old and Middle English dictionaries, first and foremost, is that the terms for swarthy in those languages, which was swart and swart, meant simply just black, which would coincide with the meaning of the term Moor, which was also originally black and denoted the original caste of people living in areas like Morocco and Tunisia, as well as other places in North Africa, which lets you know why the term swarthy was likened unto the Moor's skin color. But when we just do a quick etymological search of what this term swarthy meant when it was originally created, we can see that according to etymology.com, swarthy, or the Middle English form of swarthy, which was swart, derived from the Old English term swart, which meant simply just black. Again, Oderic of Vitalis, the same man who described Robert de Montbray, spoke the Middle or Old English languages. So during his time, or around his time, this term swarthy or swart in its original form of swart meant simply just black. That is meant being of a dark hue, i.e., the color of one's skin or their skin complexion. That is what swarthy or that is what swart or swarthy was in reference to. Okay, and then when we go down to the second paragraph, it says that the native Germanic word swart survived in the modern day English language as the term black. So it is equivalent to how we would use the term black today. And then it also goes on to state, also in Old English, get this, in reference to what? The skin color of persons. Okay, so all this stuff about how swarthy meant someone's hair color or their character, that a lot of these idiots in the comment section state swarthy meant. Look, unless something was specifically stated to be quote unquote swarthy or swart in color, other than the skin color of a person, the term almost always meant the skin color of an individual or a group of people. Okay, and here are just some extra definitions of this term swarthy or swart or swart, and how it was defined during the medieval time period from middle and old English dictionaries, like this one right here, written by a 19th century lexicographer who was also the senior editor of the Oxford Dictionary during his time period, Henry Bradley, and it states that swart derives from the Old English term swart, and it was just defined as black, as you should be able to see there. And then here is this Old English dictionary written by a man by the name of Joseph Bosworth, who was a very well-known English scholar and Old English translator during the 19th century, and he states in his dictionary under the definition of the word black, spelled B-L-A-C, which of course was the Anglo-Saxon word for what we would call today black, other than swart, but this definition he has for black includes the term swarthy. You see that? And then he also includes the Latin word I referenced earlier, which was the word for someone who was of a so-called black or swarthy complexion, right? Or a swarthy skin color or black skin color, niger. And then it also equates another Latin term, fuscus, which was kind of like a brown or dark brown color. All right. And again, all of these words are in reference to the complexion or skin color of a person when it was applied to them. Okay, we already saw this being clarified in etymology.com, but also in other dictionaries where it is defined, such as the Oxford English Dictionary, it states swart means dark in color, black or blackish, and then it states as it applies to people, it means of a person, or it means of a person's skin color or complexion. Okay, and then lastly, according to the German translator Alexander Schmidt and his dictionary dedicated to Shakespeare, he states that swart meant again black or dark of complexion or skin color. Okay, so when people such as Robert de Maubrey and even Henry of Arances are called swarthy, it was because they were being described as peoples of color or so-called black men. So Robert de Maubrey was indeed a so-called black man. And so this brings me to the very last Norman nobility figure that I want to reference, who was one of the major landowners under the rule of King Henry II of England. This man was known to history as Hugh de Lacy. Hugh de Lacy held such titles as Viceroy of Ireland, which was basically like what we would know today as a governor being a viceroy was. And he was also the first Lord of Meath, which was a land within Ireland. But his family, Hugh de Lacy's family, had a very illustrious history going all the way back to the conquest of England, and more notably to an ancestor who lived and served during the reign of King Henry I, who was the aforementioned successor of William Rufus and the last undisputed king and male heir of William the Conquerors, who went by the name of Walter de Lacy. Walter de Lacy, he received lordship over the lands in England known as Herefordshire and Shropshire. And this Walter de Lacy, he was a man of pure Norman descent, whereas I believe Hugh de Lacy was of Anglo-Norman, or a mix between Anglo-Saxon and Norman descent. But nonetheless, he was still a Norman. Hugh de Lacy was still a Norman on his father's side. And so, but Hugh de Lacy was described by a contemporary source who lived in and around his time period. And this particular chronicler, who's a very well-known medieval chronicler even down to today, was known as Gerald of Wales. Gerald of Wales himself, he was a very close confidant of the same exact ruler that Hugh de Lacy served under, which was Henry II. Let's just take a look and see how Hugh de Lacy was described by this chronicler Gerald of Wales real quick. So we're going to look at a few renditions of this particular description of Hugh de Lacy so that we can see his description by Gerald of Wales in its fullness. So let's start out by looking at this secondhand account of what Gerald of Wales was stated about Hugh de Lacy by this 20th century historian by the name of Goddard Henry Opperin. So let's read what he has to say. So Hugh de Lacy is described by Giraldus or Gerald of Wales as a swarthy man with black deep-set eyes, a flat nose, an ugly scar on his right cheek caused by a burn, a short neck, and a hairy, sinewy body. Okay, so we see here that Gerald of Wales described Hugh de Lacy as a man of a swarthy complexion. Right, we've already seen and went into depth into what swarthy meant during this time period, during the medieval time period. But then he goes on to say that he had a flat nose. So now a swarthy or black complexion, as we know that word swarthy to have meant during this time period, and a flat nose, that sure sounds like a so-called black man to me. Okay, but let's take a look at another rendition of this description that actually comes from Gerald of Wales himself and not a secondhand account, to see the comparison he makes to Hugh de Lacy and what he looked like. So let's see this quote right here that comes straight from what Mr. Gerald of Wales stated about Hugh de Lacy when he described him. So Gerald of Cambria thus described this remarkable man. If you will know what manner of man Hugh de Lacy was, you shall understand his eyes were black and deep, and his nose somewhat flat like that of an ape. So now this gives us more of a visceral image of what Hugh de Lacy would have looked like, having a flat nose like he did. Oftentimes, so-called blacks are in a racist way, mostly, but still they're compared to apes and the appearance of an ape because mainly of how flat our noses and also our general pigmentation is. So for Hugh de Lacy to have been to have had such a flat nose, to have had such a flat nose as to be compared to an ape in appearance should tell us again that this could not have been a so-called Caucasian man. But one of the things this translator left out was a description of his complexion or his skin color. So let's just take a look at one last description to see in totality what was said by Gerald of Wales about Hugh de Lacy. All right, so let's read this last description of Hugh de Lacy's appearance. So Cambrensis left us the following portrait of de Lacy, of dark or swarthy complexion, with deep and seated eyes, a flat nose, and his right cheek sadly scarred by an accidental burn. Okay, so we see the final description of Hugh de Lacy as he was described by Gerald of Wales. He is described as a man of so-called dark complexion, although I spoke about this type of translation in my last video, where I stated that oftentimes what a lot of these so-called translators or linguists will do is they'll see a word that denotes a person of color and describes a significant historical figure as a person of color, and instead of translating the actual term to what it meant, whether it be black or brown or reddish brown or even swarthy, they'll just put dark to leave more room for ambiguity of what the term dark was meant to entail in reference to that particular figure. But as we saw from the first description, Gerald of Wales actually stated that Hugh de Lacy was of a swarthy or swart complexion, which again I've already translated in detail earlier. So, but we should get the point by now. Hugh de Lacy was in fact a so-called black man without a doubt, which makes how he is depicted here rather puzzling, seeing as though he is not displayed with any of the features by this alleged medieval drawing of him, which was allegedly created by the same man who described him, Gerald of Wales. Allegedly, Gerald of Wales drew this picture right here. But this drawing, it depicts a man of pale complexion, and his nose definitely does not look flat as it was described. So this right here is an example of how even medieval art can be altered and changed around to look differently from how it was originally supposed to look. And you can still see underneath the white paint that there was no doubt that was put on this image, that the white paint that was put on this image, that it was originally painted to depict Hugh de Lacy as a man of color. You can still see kind of like the black paint underneath the white paint that was undoubtedly painted over that black paint. So, but who knows how altered this image is, but we know from the descriptions I read about Hugh de Lacy that he was a man of color with a clear, what we would call today, negroid features, right? So, which this drawing does not have. And one last way we can tell that Hugh de Lacy was indeed a man of color is by taking a look at an actual son of his who was given a certain nickname that implicated a color that was oftentimes used when describing peoples of color during the medieval time period or the Middle Ages. All right, so let's just take a look at fragments from an old Irish poem that was written that documented the name the Irish gave this son of Hugh de Lacy, who was known as William de Lacy during his lifetime, and during Hugh de Lacy, his father's governance over Ireland. So let's just read this. So the Breffine poem contains 2 verses on William, which suggest that he was active in Breffine about 1226, after recording the destruction of the ecclesiastical state site of Fanaw by the English, and the slaying of Aed Ua Rauk, which occurred in 1226. It declares, "Stoutly will I avenge my church upon the foreigners, for 'tis burning to this day that William Gorm, right, or William de Lacy, should profane me." The next line reads, "I will grant without deceit, and the noble saints of Ireland also, that William Gorm shall not obtain thereafter power over the Irish, Gaedel, until doom." So the operative term is Gorm right here, and what this word meant in the old Irish language and even the modern day Irish language is blue. Now the color blue, or the term blue, when it was applied to describe the physical appearance or skin color of a person, it was always meant to denote a person with very dark skin, i.e. a person of color or so-called black person. And this was something that was consistent throughout many different cultures in the medieval time period or during the Middle Ages, and even during antiquity, when words like ceruli, which was the word for blue in Latin, would oftentimes indicate something was dark in color or even just straight up black in color, instead of what we would think today as just being straight up blue. And then according to Middle English, words like blue, spelled B-L-E-U, blue man, it meant an Ethiopian. The term blue man meant an Ethiopian or a blackamoor or Negro. And then the Vikings, they used terms like Blamen or Blamor, which meant blue men, as terms to denote a so-called black man or so-called black men, which is why the Mauritanians or the Moors they took from their land to Ireland as slaves were called Blamen, because they were being called Negroes or so-called black men. Okay, so when it comes to this term blue and how it was applied to people when describing their physical characteristics, it did again imply that someone had a very dark skin complexion or color or skin color and was used to describe peoples of color. But now let's look at some examples of this real quick here. So let's first start out by reading this article from theguardian.com and see how this Irish term for blue or Gorm was used when describing a person. So let's read this first paragraph right here. The Irish language has long wrestled with the description of people who are not white, and fear dub would refer to a man of any color with black hair or black skin. When capitalized, fear dub was also referred to the devil. For generations, Irish speakers used an odd alternative, Dwin Gorm, blue person, to indicate people who were not white. Okay, so according to this article, a blue or Gorm person was a person who was quote unquote not white, i.e. a person of color. Now, the person who wrote this article, who was a so-called African woman, I believe, this is her picture right here, but this African woman who wrote this article goes on to state that Gorm should not be a term that is used to describe so-called black people, since black people aren't literally quote-unquote blue. So she goes about in this article explaining why the term Gorm should be a word that is eradicated from the Irish language to describe so-called black people. But this is why it is important to truly examine the etymology of these terms like Gorm, or even other terms we'll look at in a little bit that mean blue from the Middle Ages, because it helps us to understand why certain people in history, such as William de Lacy, were given these names to describe their physical appearance and skin complexion. Even groups like the Moors and the Saracens and even the Picts of Scotland were referred to as blue, and they were referred to as such because they were so-called black people. All those people were so-called black. So understanding what these terms meant and why they were given to the people they were applied to is important when trying to study history and examine history and who was who in history. But anyway, let's just take a look at a few examples of what this term Gorm means. All right, and we can start with this online dictionary, this online Irish to English dictionary, and its definition's account of what Gorm means. So let's read this. So Gorm, blue, blue color, blue flame, as blue as indigo, blue bag. All right, let's just skip down to the bottom real quick. So next to the of person section at the bottom, we can see that Gorm translates to Negro, and then it also states Gorm was meant to indicate the quote unquote Negro races. So again, yes, this term Gorm was a word that ultimately was meant to indicate a so-called black person or black people. Okay, and then just to add an extra definition to further put this into perspective, this definition right here on this online dictionary into perspective, on the word sense dictionary, the definition of Gorm underneath the section where it translates it for the Irish language, it states that Gorm meant blue, but then underneath it states people of skin or black skin color, right? So-called black. So again, the term blue during the medieval time period and going all the way back to the ancient world with civilizations like the ancient Egyptians, the ancient peoples of India, etc., where they would depict their so-called gods as blue-skinned. It was meant to help indicate that those figures or those particular mythological figures were very dark-skinned and had the complexion that we would associate today with a so-called black person's complexion. Okay, just as an aside, I believe the Hindu god Krishna, who's almost always been depicted as blue-skinned going back to ancient times, that particular god's name quite literally means black or black-skinned. And in the ancient world, all the Hindu gods and goddesses were portrayed as so-called black people. But that is a completely different topic for another day. But just as it was for those civilizations and how they used those words like blue to denote a person of color or so-called black person, so it was with the medieval Irish, which is why they gave that name to William de Lacy, because he, like we already read about his father, was a so-called black man. But I just want to read a few more examples of this term Gorm and how when applied to someone's physical appearance, it meant that they were a person of color. Right, so here is yet another Irish to English dictionary written by a 19th century Irish lexicographer and historian by the name of Edward O'Reilly. And again, just keep in mind that this man was an Irish man, and so that means he spoke the Irish and Gaelic language, which gives him extra credibility. Okay, so but let's just read how he defines Gorm. And so he states Gorm means two things. It means to be blue, and then a Moor. Now the term Moor, the term Moor that this dictionary is referring to are the Moors of North Africa, and we should already know from earlier examples that the word Moor was, and to some degree still is, a term that was a synonym for a Negro, and we can see why that was just from the earlier examples I showed of the Moors and them being portrayed as so-called black people in medieval manuscripts, and even other figures in history who have been recorded as so-called black have been given that name Moor to denote them as being black or so-called black, like the African explorer Esteban the Moor, or the servant of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who went by the name of Johannes Moor. And the concept of the so-called Moor's head that people still to this day try to use as an excuse for why so-called blacks are depicted on various royal coats of arms all throughout Europe during the medieval time period. So, but yes, that term Moor is meant to indicate a so-called Negro or black person. Now let's just take a look at another example, this time from a book that was written by a learned society of scholars in Great Britain that I believe still exists to this day, known as the Philological Society. So let's read what they stated about this term Gorm and what it meant. So Gorm here in this story they're citing from above means black, not blue, just as Fear Gorm means a Negro, not a blue man. Okay, so this right here gives a little insight into what the term Gorm and even blue, when applied to a person's physical characteristics, was meant to entail. It didn't quite literally mean blue. It was just a colloquial term that was used to denote someone who had a very dark skin complexion to the point where their skin may have looked blue or almost black. So again, this is why various civilizations from the ancient world to antiquity to the medieval time period used the color blue to denote someone who was very dark-skinned and what we would call today so-called black, whether it was a deity figure or a historical figure. But I just want to read one more example of how this term blue was defined by the Irish to mean a so-called black person, to drive this point home even further about William de Lacy being called William Gorm or William de Gorm, like which would indicate that he, like his father, was a so-called black man. All right, so this is the infamous book, Ancient and Modern Britons, that a lot of naysayers about so-called black rulership in Europe seem to not trust, because obviously they don't want to due to the fact that this author, the author of this book, David McRitchie, who was a so-called Caucasian man, by the way, basically acts as a whistleblower pertaining to the real historical fact that so-called blacks did indeed rule Europe and were the main inhabitants of Europe during the medieval time period up until a certain time. But let's read what his account is about how the term Gorm was used during the medieval time period or the Middle Ages, and what the people it applied to were stated to have looked like as well. So let's read. So a complimentary witness with Maurice is Gorm, found attached to the names of Highland and other chiefs and kings. So just right here real quick, this author David McRitchie equates the term Gorm with Morus, which, if you remember from earlier, I showed that Morus was, I believe, the Latin term for the Moors, and based off of the depictions I showed of them and what that term Morus means, which is black, it should be fairly obvious why McRitchie equates Gorm to Morus, because it meant a so-called black person, just as Morus did. But then also he states that Scottish Highland chiefs and kings were given these names of Gorm and Morus, which basically meant that they were being referred to as so-called black people when they had those nicknames applied to them. So again, this author David McRitchie is a very controversial author with a lot of his stances about history, because he acted as a whistleblower to real history in Europe during the medieval time period and what the people during that time period looked like. Okay, but he is in fact a reliable source regarding the history of that era. So let's just keep reading what he has to say here. So this word is given in the Gaelic dictionaries as signifying blue of whatever shade, also green as grass, and this recalls the fact that the indigenous tribes described by Caesar were both styled Veritas green and Caeruli blue, from the woad with which they stained their bodies, the color of which may come under either of these headings. And the people he is referring to are the Aboriginal peoples of Scotland known as the Picts, who were so-called black people themselves. But that will be something for another day when I talk about that in the near future. But reading on, he says, so let's skip plain to where it says plainly. So plainly, therefore, a man who is titled Gorm is a man. Now, although in the Gaelic or in the Gaelic of Scotland, a Negro is known as Dwyn Dub, a black man, he is known in the Gaelic of Ireland, the place the land of Ireland, which was the place where William de Lacy ruled over. A black man or a Negro is known as Dwyn Gorm. Okay, so MacRitchie states that a Negro or so-called black man in the Gaelic Irish language was in fact Dwyn Gorm, which when you look it up, Dwyn Gorm quite literally means a black person. All right, so again, this term Gorm was in fact a word that denoted a so-called black person and was given to Hugh de Lacy, his son William de Lacy, because he was, like his father, a so-called black man. Like his father Hugh de Lacy, he was a so-called black man. So the de Lacy family, who was a Norman family, were so-called black people as a whole, and as a ton of other Norman nobility families as well. They were also so-called black, but I'm not going to go into that right now in this series. I'm probably going to make a separate series about the various families and clans of not just the Normans, but families all around medieval Europe that had surnames that quite literally denoted them being of a swarthy or brown or even black complexion, which undoubtedly meant that they were so-called peoples of color or so-called black people. But just to give a brief overview of what happened to the rest of the Norman dynasty after William II's reign had ended with his death in 1100 AD, his younger brother, who was the last remaining male heir to William the Conqueror, Henry I, took his place as King of England. And I already spoke about the appearance of Henry I in my last video, but if you haven't seen it or need a reminder, he himself was described as a man of so-called dark complexion, and also he was described as having dark, curly, or tightly curled, coiled hair. Okay, but as it pertains to that term dark complexion, once again, most modern translators, like the ones who translated his description in these books I'm showing you guys right here that cite how he was described, they will try and substitute words that were meant to indicate someone being a person of color by just injecting the word quote unquote dark by the term to imply their skin color. But in reality, Henry I was most likely described as being of a swarthy or another term that was used to denote a person of color. Once again, I showed an example of this from my last video where one of his illegitimate children, who was known as Marler Fitzhenry, was actually described as swarthy during his lifetime, but a lot of modern day translators rendered that term swarthy, or rendered that exact word to describe his complexion as dark as well, just like his father. But he was in fact originally described as swarthy, and we should already know that that term swarthy and what that term swarthy meant during the medieval time period. Right, it meant somebody who was a person of color, not a so-called tan Caucasian man. Okay, but Henry I went on to rule England for probably the longest amount of time of any of the predecessors that came before him, ruling the country for over 30 years from 1100 to 1135. And then once he died in 1135, there were no legitimate male successors of his, since his only legitimate son, William Adelin, had died in the tragic White Ship tragedy of 1120. And so this led to a struggle that ensued between Henry I's daughter, who was the Empress Matilda, and her cousin, Stephen of Blois, who was a descendant of William the Conqueror on his mother's side, with his mother being known as Adela of Normandy. I believe she was a daughter of William the Conqueror's. Which made Stephen of Blois a maternal grandson of William the Conqueror's. Okay, so but this led to an over 18-year long conflict known to history as the Anarchy, and it was a bloody civil war that ensued on both sides, mainly again due to conflicts over the throne and who had the right to sit on the throne after Henry I had died. The Empress Matilda, who was Henry I's daughter, was previously the Empress of Germany due to being married to Henry V of Germany. But once Henry V of Germany died in 1125, this caused Matilda to seek after another husband just 3 years later, and she found one in the French Count of Anjou, who went by the name of Geoffrey Plantagenet. of the royal Frankish royal house of Ingler, which went back centuries in France. But once she married Geoffrey Plantagenet, they had 3 children together, and the oldest one was a son who went by the name of Henry, and this same Henry would go on to be the one that ended the anarchy in November of 1153 and would be crowned King of England on December the 19th, 1154. And from here is where we will transition to the longest lasting English dynasty in the country's history, which also happened to be the most tumultuous and war-torn dynasty in its history as well, the Plantagenet dynasty. This dynasty laid the groundwork for England as a country moving forward, even down to today, and is arguably one of the most, if not the most, storied and overall greatest dynasties in not just English history, but all of medieval Europe history. And just like the Normans, which was comprised of rulers that descended from the great William the Conqueror, who himself was a descendant of Rollo, the Danish Viking, and a descendant of Rollo was the descendant of the Dub Gaul, Dub Genti, the Negri Gentis, the Guerduan Danes, who were undoubtedly peoples of color. So it was for the Plantagenets. They were so-called black too, and they carried a lot of the Danish Norman lineage as well, but also the so-called black Frankish lineage too, as well. So, but that will be for the next video, so take a look out for those videos.